Greetings and welcome to another Educator Innovator webinar. It's Tuesday, March 17th, and we've had some technical difficulties, but we are here. So it's a great time to discuss design and designing in education. I'm your host, Jessica Parker, an associate professor at Sonoma State University and the director of the Maker Certificate program there. Today, our guests are both educational researchers and practitioners, and they are going to discuss a key issue in making and learning. Design. So they're going to help us define design and give us examples of designing in education. Our panelists work at a number of different settings in the Bay Area, including a K-12 charter school, a K-8 independent school, and the Exploratorium in San Francisco. And they are here today to share their observations, findings, and of course specific examples when it comes to designing in education. So glad you guys are here. Let's let our guests introduce themselves, starting with Molly. Go for it, please.
Hi, my name is Molly Shea. I'm a Learning Sciences PhD, and I work at the Exploratorium. I'm the director of Center for Informal Learning in Schools, and part of our work is studying high-quality, equity-oriented tinkering in STEM education.
Wonderful. Thanks for being here.
Thanks
Aaron.
for having me.
I'm Vanderwerff, and I work at Lighthouse Community Charter School in the Creativity Lab here, and essentially my job is as an instructional coach to help people integrate making and design into their practice, whether it's during school hours or after school or as part of an elective.
Wonderful, thanks so much. So we are still waiting for another member of our group, Ilya Pratt, to join us. She's having technical difficulties, and when she pops up, we'll let her introduce herself. So before we get started, though, if you're watching this Hangout from the Educator Innovator blog page, we really encourage you to jump into the chat room to converse with others who are watching. We'll be posting links to resources there throughout the webinar. So can you guys help us frame this discussion, right? I mean, the goal of this series is to try to bring researchers and practitioners together and to have an intimate conversation. And since we picked such a broad topic of design, could you talk about really the multiple ways that you all engage in design, either as a researcher and or a practitioner? So Molly, do you mind if I pick on you? What is design when you're out there as a researcher or actually working at the Exploratorium as well? What are you doing and why?
Okay, so thanks. This is a large question, and I think everyone engages in design in some way and probably have their own answer for this. But when I think about this from a learning sciences perspective, I think about when we do research and practice partnerships and actually design learning environments together, that's one notion of design. And one of the main important aspects of that is whose problem is it that you're designing to solve, and why. And so you can really think about design from the perspective of designing a research project. You can also think of design with respect to a learning environment. So what are the material resources in a learning space? What are the pedagogical philosophies available in a learning space? Who are the kids? What do they care about? And what are you actually hoping that they'll learn from this learning, from the projects and pedagogy that you put forth? And then finally, when we think about engineering, oftentimes there's a design element there. So there's really thinking through designing for a particular problem, the environment, the constraints of the problem, and then what are the solutions that are available, and oftentimes people don't think enough about what are the ways in which the culture and the social practices of those who would use that design would engage with it. So those are some ways we think about design.
Wonderful, thanks for that. Aaron, do you want to add on from a practitioner perspective?
Sure. So I think something that helps me is just to think about some of the kind of words that you might hear out there when we're thinking about design. And a couple that I know we hear a lot are engineering design and design thinking. And often these two are used interchangeably. I think it's particularly important for us to think about kind of each of these pieces and how they're used. And I think it depends on, obviously, like Molly was saying, it depends on who the practitioner is, because some people, I mean, everybody has their own definitions for these things. But as I look at, for example, the kind of D-School version of design thinking, it's a pretty specific format for kind of attacking a problem. And in particular, often it's to come up with a product or a process. And empathy is particularly strong, so we're interviewing people and thinking about what they're looking for in this product or process that we're trying to create. Whereas in engineering design, in a classroom setting, an example would be, to build a bridge that spans a foot and can hold 50 pounds. And our final user, the most important thing is that when we drive our car across the bridge, it doesn't break. And so often in engineering, we have different, more kind of technical design constraints. And so that's often how it also happens in the class. So it is helpful sometimes to think of these categories as ways to really engage in this in the classroom, and think about where entrepreneurship might fit better, etc.
Wonderful. Molly, anything to add on based on what Aaron said?
No, I mean, I think that Aaron really alluded to this nice point that there are particular, what's the consequence of the design? Who's going to be using it? Why do they care about it? What's consequential for the group in terms of what do they value, and why do students care about the design that they're building? And so I think that there's a lot that goes into the pedagogical moves that allow teachers to really get kids engaged. Another thing is, who's really doing the designing? Is it the teacher that came up with the whole project and then kids are assembling something? Or is it really based on the values and the interests of the students, but within some kind of constraint given by the teacher or after-school educator in some way?
Great, thank you. So then let's bring this to the student perspective, right? We've kind of tried to narrow our focus on design, focusing on engineering design, design thinking, learning sciences in terms of research-based design. Can we talk about it from the student perspective? Why do we design with them? What are their current experiences with design like? And potentially talk through your goals when you're designing activities for students, whether it's in school, after school, with your own kids, etc. Who wants to jump in and tackle that one?
Aaron, go for it.
Great. I can start. I was hoping Ilya would be here at this point. Ilya has done a lot of work around using some thinking routines that were created in this Agency by Design project. And in particular, what I find interesting about these is that they are just thinking routines, and so they're very open, but they really ask students to kind of look at kind of the way the world is designed. And so not only the design of physical objects, which is often where engineering design or design thinking end up kind of heading, but the design of systems, the design of the school they're in, the design of the government, the design of historical movements. And so when we take a look at Agency by Design, we can really think of design in a much broader category than is often used, and it really allows us to apply these same the same methods of thinking that we would to a problem we're encountering to kind of the broader world. And so in terms of really helping students to feel like this is something they care about, it gives them a choice in terms of what they want to look at. And it also is open enough, so as an example, the first thinking routine that they generally encounter is called parts, purposes, and complexities. And so an example I like to use is, in an English class, we might be looking at a text, and very often, traditionally we would have a worksheet to ask us what the setting is, and why is the setting that way, and who are the characters, and why are the characters that way. And that really feels like I'm being led through this experience. Whereas if I ask students what are the parts, purposes, and complexities of this text, the students are going to identify characters and setting. They're going to identify all the things that are important to us. And if they don't, we can kind of get there through conversation. But that really, I think, builds student agency when they're able to see that design of that text.
Thank you for that. So we'll make sure we add the link to the parts, purposes, and complexity document from Agency by Design to make sure that's available to folks. I appreciate that, Erin. So just to recap a bit, in terms of engagement, designing with students allows them to bring choice, bring themselves to the table in a way that is purposeful and meaningful for them. Molly, do you want to add on from your research perspective?
Sure. I'm part of an NSF project that does research practice partnerships, and we're looking at tinkering and after school. So one of the things that I spend my time doing is hanging out with kids and facilitators in a community-based organization called Community Science Workshop. We've also done research and are continuing to do research at TechBridge, Boys and Girls Club, as well as Discovery Science Cubed. And so in each of these spaces, we're noticing that one of the really exciting parts of designing with kids is getting into the practice of the practice of essentially like having kids come up with an idea, asking questions that lead to deeper inquiry, and whether it's about weight and battery power, but sort of how do you get kids to own an idea? And really continue to want to improve upon it. And we've noticed that there's a lot of projects, the more that you can think about iteration or drafts, the ways in which kids come up with this larger-than-life idea, and letting them design for that, model for that, try it out, and see, like, okay, what did we learn from this? Basically collect some data about, like, why do we think this isn't working, why do we think it might be working, and then how can we go about another draft where we get to try again. So the reason why this is important for why we design with kids is because it really allows them to be sort of the owner of what success looks like in a project, and it owns a little bit more of what they learned through the design and iteration process. So.
Wonderful, thanks for that. Ilya, you've joined us. Thank you for persevering.
Thank you.
All right, can you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Can you hear me? How about now?
Yes, sounds great. Can you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Super. Hi, I'm Ilya Pratt, and I'm at Parkday School in Oakland, California, and I am a learning specialist by profession for the last 20 or so years here. I am the director of our Design, Make, Engage program, which explores this world of designing and making, and then I'm also one of the members of the Agency by Design learning community group.
Wonderful. Thanks for being here. We were just talking about design experiences and, in fact, Agency by Design, parts, processes, and procedures, if I got that correct. And so when you feel like you're ready to tell us more about that, I'll turn to you. But in the meantime, Molly and Erin, so bringing up this idea of allowing students to own their own idea, own their work, own their design process. So I'm thinking from an administrative viewpoint. It sounds like this design thing is wonderful and great, but does this really tie to the standards? I need, with next generation science standards and Common Core standards coming through, show me how this connects. How does this design thing connect to the standards? Because I need to make a case to my parents and teachers and the students that this actually is going to meet those standards. Can you guys respond to that?
Sure. Erin, do you want to go first, or do you want me to jump in?
Go ahead.
Okay. So I've offered a couple of tools. One of the groups that we're working with is the University of Washington in our collaboratory project, and they have come up with several practitioner guides for thinking about engineering and design with NGSS. And some of the important things that there's two practice briefs that are particularly helpful for thinking about design. One of them is thinking about how is engineering different from STEM, or science, the science components. And one of those things is that in engineering, well, in science, you're often observing the natural world and trying to understand what's going on in the natural world in one way or another. In engineering, you're thinking about a problem in the world and designing a kind of solution for that particular problem. And so that's a really nice way to think about how design problems can be connected to NGSS, and you can dive deeper into that through those STEM teaching tools. The second thing that's really related to kids going into engineering eventually is to think one of the major components, one of 4 components in like undergraduate education for engineering is thinking about what is the problem, and that often doesn't get a lot of a lot of the attention in engineering and in college, but it's incredibly important, and especially when you think about designing in other people's communities. What does it really mean if you design something that doesn't work in the ways in which people interact with one another and interact with the environment around them, or if the system in which people live doesn't allow them to fully utilize a design. And so those are there's a STEM teaching tool to really think about how do we think about design as connected to people's everyday lives, to their values, and to their cultural practices.
Wonderful, thank you. Aaron or Ilya, do you guys want to add on?
I was going to say that I think that's really great, great connections to NGSS, and I was actually going to prompt Ilya to share some of the Agency by Design work, because I think just a quick thing is that Agency by Design came out of this Project Zero Making Thinking Visible work, and really the Common Core talks a lot about having students share their thinking and be able to explain why they're doing things. So Ilya, can you give us a couple examples from your practice?
Sure. So the Project Zero folks are all about thinking routines, and those thinking routines being routines, sort of questioning, process of questioning that allows you to develop a thinking disposition, a particular thinking disposition. So in this case, the thinking dispositions of designers or makers are what the Agency by Design project is exploring. And so an example of routines are, as Jessica was trying to get in the beginning, parts, purposes, complexities is the sort of the ground, the foundation routine. And then they go from that one to basically routines concerned with thinking about systems. So if you think about parts, purposes, and complexities or systems, it's learning to recognize the parts of an object or a greater system, and within that, the relationships between those parts, and then and the relationship between the parts and the whole, and then knowing that if you are someone who has learned to become sensitive to noticing the parts and the whole, then you of course then have more entry point for you could find the entry points for making positive change within that system. Or fixing that object if you want to fix an object. So that's at the heart of the Agency by Design work, is that whole idea of being able to understand basically how something's made, or recognize the system and how it's made, and then having the empowerment to make positive change within it.
Great, thank you so much. These are wonderful insights. And remind the folks, the audience that's listening or listening in the archive, all those resources that we've been talking about are available with the links, and we will make sure we add them there, so you will not, don't be afraid. We will make sure you get those resources if they're not currently online and posted on the webinar right now. All right, so let's think about then a challenge to folks. So if I'm interested in this design stuff and I'm curious, where do I even begin? Could you pose a challenge to our listeners around something that they could engage in related to design, and that's something that you guys have done that really resonates with kids, that they could do themselves, they could do with their own kids, their kids at school, wherever it might be. So could you talk about a challenge that we could pose to listeners related to design, and really give them a specific example? Does that make sense what I'm asking? Perfect. All right, Aaron, I'll pick on you. Go for it.
So I'm going to kind of answer your question. I'll eventually answer your question. My starting place is that we need to be conscious of where students are starting from. And so obviously we don't want to set the bar too low, but at the same time, something that we found at Lighthouse is when students are not familiar with designing things or designing processes, that asking them to design something, for example, we have our students take projects to the Maker Faire. And if I just say, hey guys, you're going to take a project to the Maker Faire in 6 months, you need to design it. Before you do anything, draw up the whole thing, right? They're completely unfamiliar with what steps they're going to need to take. And what really ends up happening is more like what we kind of see as the replacement of the scientific method in science, where instead of things happening in a very linear way, right, they happen kind of bouncing around these different pieces like analyzing data, etc. Where in design, that might be they're tinkering or playing for a little bit, trying to understand something, then they decide to add that to their plan, and then they're going out and doing some research and figuring things out, coming back again to their plan. And so that design process, we don't necessarily need to have the expectation that that's a linear process. And so what have we had our students do? So as an example, in 7th grade, I'll give 2 different examples of where they've designed something. The 7th and 8th grade elective teacher has them design some sort of appendage to pick things up. And he gives them inputs on a daily basis. So the first day, he just kind of poses the question and asks them to draw what they think they might do. The second day, he shows them an example. The third day, he shows them things in nature or in the world that are different than a hand, because everybody wants to just make a hand, because that's what we're used to, and tries to nudge them out of their comfort zone. So that's an example of kind of a shorter, clearer design project. Another design project more along the lines of design thinking was that our 7th and 8th graders actually created mini maker spaces for the kindergartners who were their end users. So they interviewed the kindergarten teacher, they observed and interviewed kindergartners, and then they got some used furniture that they repurposed to be able to store things and allow kindergartners to do the kind of making they wanted to do in their classrooms. So those are just a couple ideas of projects that we've done here at Lighthouse.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. Ilya, how about you?
So my challenge to the listeners is to first listen to their students, and within that listening, listen to what they're complaining about, and then point that out to them, that they are complaining about that thing, that they've identified a problem, in effect, to tackle, and then and challenge them to find a solution to that problem. And within this, I think it might be, the way the lunch line is organized, or something in the classroom is organized. It provides a very familiar situation for them, a system that they can very easily identify the parts of, and then and from there feel the empowerment of changing their immediate community for the better. So start there, really listening to what the kids are talking about. What are they challenged by, and how can we address those problems?
Wonderful. So I can ask my 3.5-year-old and say, hey, the carpet needs to be cleaned. Is that a problem for you? And see what happens? No, I will try to listen. I will try to listen to him. But Ilya, do you have examples from Park Day that you could give us that you guys have done related to that notion of listening to the students?
Yes, thank you. Several. I guess our school is very much about social justice work, and we've done not so much social justice, but we've done the classroom fixes. If kids have identified problems within the classrooms, they, as a community, have worked to solve them and make a better system. And then we definitely embrace it as a whole school. Like if kids identify a problem on the playground, helping them be empowered to address that problem, come up with the solutions, and then work with the rest of the community around that problem and solutions. And then, so most recently, we have the whole phenomenon of Ferguson and black youth and prejudice and that whole great big tangle of social justice work that we need to do. And recently a student at our neighboring high school was killed, and so some of our kids, the older kids, are aware of this, and out of that awareness came well, what can we do about it as a school community? And so through a lot of staff discussions, but also kid discussions, they basically have designed their a vigil or a protest march up the street in front of the neighboring school. So that's kind of taking it to the social justice level, a big let's act on this, let's understand the larger problem of why all this injustice is going on, and then finding a way to take some kind of action in this incredibly complex problem.
Thank you very much. Molly, could you talk about it from your perspective as a researcher? I mean, the audience has heard about listening to students, getting involved and taking action from Ilya, scaffolding the design process from Aaron. What kind of perspective do you have as a researcher in terms of a challenge to our listeners?
Sure, with some examples too. I'd like to try and tie into both what Aaron and Ilya said already, because I think they're really important, and I'm happy both of these ideas came up. So I've thought of kind of two interesting examples, and I'll first pose kind of a challenge to the listeners, and it goes right along with really deeply listening to youth. We all make meaning in very different ways, and depending on what kind of meaning we make, we come up with different solutions. And so design is not sort of apolitical or a sort of cultural. It's always embedded in the practices of our everyday lives. And so I think it's really important to consider that. And so along with listening to students, oftentimes I think educators and researchers are really interested in finding the thing they want to find and getting to the end of the day or the end of the research project with the answer we want kids to have or we want to have. But there's a role for stories in design, whether it's in research design or in engineering design, and of course also in social justice work, like what kind of meaning are people making, and therefore how can we understand these designs to be valuable to communities? And so one thing that hasn't been brought up yet is art as a way of design and story as a way to hear how kids are making meaning in the work that they're doing to design new futures, if in their schools or communities or in an imaginary toy that they're making. And so one example is, how do you kind of allow kids' stories to be part of a design? And so an example I'll use is a little girl, I'd say probably 6 or 7 years old, was making a popsicle stick house. And she had designed it with her mom in an after-school space. And at the end, I was interviewing her about, what did you make? And she said, well, I made a fairy house. And that was the first I'd heard about the fairy in the house. And she said she started to tell a story essentially about how when the fairy comes home, the light will go on in the house. And right now it was just glue and popsicle sticks and paint. But there were some kids at the other side of the table actually building lights on their houses or the structures that they had made. And so I said, well, what are you going to do next in your project? And she said, well, I'm going to go put a light on so we can, when the fairy comes home, we can turn on the light. So in this case, if you really listen deeply to what kids want and you hear the stories and why those stories have meaning for their design, they'll take you in places that you didn't imagine as a researcher, as an educator. And so that can take you into protests, and that can take you into ways of rethinking power dynamics at a school and ways that kids might imagine their projects and the utility that those projects will have for other parts of their life. So the challenge is to, how do you listen to kids' stories and how do you help incorporate those stories into their designs? And then the second one is about prototyping. So, whenever I'm building something, I get frustrated a lot because I'm a terrible carpenter and electrician. So one way to think about when kids get frustrated or when adults get frustrated is to think about this current prototype or model that you have, and what's the next iteration, what's the next prototype. And so instead of thinking about how can kids make something more perfect, or this isn't working right, or something like that, like how do you think of what's already happened as a success, and what you learn from it is leading to your next prototype or your next model.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I love the idea that there's a role for stories in all of this, especially since that allows the students and the kids and the learners to pick their own tools, whether it's popsicle sticks, whether it's a microscope, whether it might be digital media, or something else, a crane. They need a crane for some reason. And so that's exciting, because I think that level of empowerment really brings it back to a notion of being literate. Being literate means that you know which tool you need to actually solve this problem at hand, or design a solution for this problem at hand. Aaron, Ilya, anything that Molly talked about, anything resonate with you?
I feel like this idea of iteration is pretty big. Often in school we're used to writing drafts in English class or in history class. But when we do a science project or an engineering project or a design project, we do it once and then we're kind of like, okay, that's it. We're done with that. Same with science experiments. And, I think that students learn a lot from having the opportunity to take the time to do that. And I think I never quite set a challenge, and I would say my challenge is to find the time, to be able to take the time to listen to students and give them the chance to iterate and hear their stories for things or see their reasoning behind things. Because the most powerful projects are the ones where things happen that we don't expect. If we know the answer, I think Molly was referring to this piece, if we already know the answer, then it's not going to be a terribly empowering project. But if it could go in many different directions, and even an engineering project can go in many different directions if it's complicated enough, and we really give it the time to do that, then either different kids can pursue different directions, or students can have interactions with each other about which direction the class is going to take. So I really encourage people to do as my colleagues have talked about and listen to kids, hear what they're talking about, and be willing to take it in those different directions.
Thank you. Ilya, you want to add on?
Yeah, I'll add on to that. So then, of course, there's also the concept of brainstorming. And kids, they generally get really wedded to their idea very quickly. They don't really want to consider other ideas. So in looking at the thinking disposition of a designer, you can really emphasize taking in lots of different ideas, and along with that iterative process, really being listening to your friends' ideas. So the collaboration part, the working as a community towards a solution, all those things are great entry points for student learning. And yeah, that was the main thing. I had another one I forgot.
No worries. If it comes in, let us know. It comes back. So if part of design and the design process and designing an education is to not guide learners to a predetermined answer or a predetermined solution, it seems like that might kind of ruffle some feathers with teachers, to feel like, well, I don't know where we're going, what do I need to do? And there might be a little bit of anxiety and nervousness around that. So what is your advice then for educators who are interested in learning more about design and designing an education? What would be your advice to them? If we know that they might have this nervousness or anxiety around not having kind of a predetermined solution or answer that they're shooting for. What do we think?
Well, I think the best education comes from risk-taking. So celebrate that nervousness, and if you can, find a partner to go on your first journey with, so you can both commiserate at your confused whatever project outcome. I've certainly done that with some teachers, where we went, oh well, we know the kids did learn something. It wasn't our intended objective, but they did learn something. So be brave and have fun with it, rather than dwell on what you think is wasted time, because chances are the kids actually did really get some strong learnings out of whatever it was that happened.
Thank you. Aaron or Molly?
Sure. I completely agree with that collaborative piece. I think it's great to be able to find a colleague. I think that can really make things go more smoothly and help with the reflective piece of things, especially. I also think that often when we're thinking about kind of progressive education, making, design, we think that there's no structure. All of these different, engineering design, design thinking, agency by design, these are structures to help us provide some of the walls around or within, which we can try to figure out what we're doing as a classroom community. And the same thing goes if we think back to the standards, because, we're responsible for teaching the Common Core and the NGSS here at Lighthouse, and we can't just go anywhere. And so the question is where, what boundaries do we put up, and then what freedoms do we allow for students? And I think that's determined by whatever our learning goals are for the activity. But if I think about the example of learning about motion and forces by building mousetrap cars, which is a pretty common activity for schools to do, that definitely includes an engineering design piece to it, and can include some of the scientific experimentation. And we've set up the walls, but we also are allowing the kids a lot of freedom when it comes to designing their final product. And so I definitely encourage educators to think about what their goals are for the experience, not just in terms of content learning goals, but process learning goals, and where they want to, kind of setting aside time to think about where they want to allow for degrees of freedom and where they're going to limit things. And that's where we've seen things. Be.
Can you say more about process goals? What could you give us an example of what a process goal might be related to an activity, a designing activity?
Sure. I mean, the NGSS practices I think are great examples of goals that we might set, but a little bit more broadly might be that we're developing students' ability to see, kind of the design of the world around them, so that when they look at a wall, they understand that there's a structure behind that wall, and they understand what's there. And so then I might do a take apart to be able, a take apart of an object to be able to really understand what that looks like more. Or we might have collaboration process goals, where we're really focusing on, our students able to work together to solve a particular problem. Or some of the social justice pieces.
Great, thank you. Molly, do you want to add?
Sure, yeah. I think these will probably be related to what Aaron was talking about as well. But I think that this nervousness about sort of control in the classroom, or really letting a design process happen and it goes in directions you didn't expect. Some things that maybe teachers can control are different, right, than they would be if you're doing a more specific curriculum that has everyone guided in a particular way that we're more accustomed to with books and other lectures and things like that. So one thing is you can control and think about how kids are capturing their ideas in journals. As a way to understand what and sort of do some formative assessment about what kids are learning. Another thing that you can really do is think about leaving time at the end of the day for reflection. So bringing the class back together with 10 minutes left to think about, okay, what worked, what didn't work in your design, and what would you do next time with this design, something like that. So you're not controlling sort of, who's making what when and what questions they have. You can't do that, right, if you're really going to lead open-ended design projects, but you can think about designing the time differently so that there's journals and reflection as a way to sort of get rid of a little bit of the nervousness and allow the process to happen, and then see through those two times, like what kids are learning in a way that you might not be accustomed to.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So let's talk about the resources available, because we've thrown a lot at the audience, right? We've defined design in many different ways. We've given them examples of kind of from the student experience of how they can engage in designing. We gave them hopefully what I think is great advice, right? So what would be resources that you suggest if I'm someone that maybe won't dive right into creating something or in the design process? What resources can you suggest for educators that are interested in learning more about design? And Ilya, do you mind if we start with you and Agency by Design? We've been throwing this phrase around, but it'd be nice to give a little more context. I know you gave some, but also specific resources, maybe even the white paper that we put on the resource list.
Yeah. Agencybydesign.org is the website now for the research project. So on that you can find the initial findings white paper from the researchers, and that gives you a good summary of the whole context of the research project and the initial outcomes. And it would be really good for if you are in a school and you need to garner administrative support. That white paper might be helpful as you work out that strategy. And then also on that website you'll find the thinking routines, including parts, purposes, and complexities, and the others that deal more with systems thinking. So they're there. They're very, very simple. So it's a great entry point. Parts, purposes, complexities is my favorite thinking routine ever. You can use it. You'll just start doing that with everything. You'll formulate everything you have to say, thinking about parts and purposes, eventually, if you work with it enough. And it's very useful. And it really gives some great insight into how children think, too, whether or not they can really kind of go there once you turn on that switch of thinking about how things are made. So that's there. And then also embedded in that website are examples of practice. So you'll find one I did on, for example, on T-stools in there, and some other of the educators that are involved in the early work of the project. So some really, and they're pretty comprehensive write-ups that we did of that work to give you some good solid examples of how to use those thinking routines. So would be my main.
Thanks for that. Molly, Aaron, you guys want to add?
Aaron, should I go? Okay. We have a couple of resources that might be useful if you're interested in NGSS or connecting design to next generation science standards. The STEMteachingtools.org has what we're calling practice briefs. They're written by University of Washington researchers alongside teachers in the classroom. So these are really they're the outcome of researchers and practitioners coming together to design learning environments together. And so there are a couple that are embedded with ideas from research, but really relatable and used by teachers. And there's also a lot of teacher expertise in there too, in terms of like how to start a design project and how to think about community engagement or the community and how you're designing with the community in mind. The second one has to do with is a website called Relating Research to Practice, and it's a website that has about 350 research briefs. They're 2-page synthesis of peer-reviewed journals on science education, and there's a lot in there about long-term interest in science, thinking about kids' identity and long-term engagement. There's also a lot on equity-oriented thinking and pedagogy as they relate to science and engineering. And I think I have some up on. I think I have some of those resources on the page that you put out.
And if you have additional resources, we can make sure to add those, Molly, so don't worry. We'll get them in the hands of the audience. Aaron, how about you?
I think the other things that we added to that that page were just around design thinking, so kind of around the D-School work and their K-12 network there. And then just that there is professional development available through Sonoma State, through Lighthouse, etc. And I believe, you know, Agency by Design folks are starting to do those as well. And I think these are all great opportunities to get out there in terms of like a way to get started, meet like-minded folks, and really engage.
Great, thank you. So we have 1 minute left. No pressure, right? Not at all. But anything that you feel like we need to just tackle quickly in 140 characters before we say goodbye to our amazing audience. Anything that we missed, or anything that you want to make sure we repeat.
We forgot to name the resource of the East Bay Maker Educator Meetup Group and the Bay Area Maker Educator Meetup Groups. Come and join us.
Please do, please do. I will make sure to put those links there. And the Exploratorium is also running a MOOC this summer in July. Molly, do you want to add more about that?
Sure, I can add, there will be a MOOC from the Tinkering Studio coming out again this summer, and we're also doing the California Network. We'll be putting out videos and tools related to equity-oriented, STEM-rich tinkering, and so be looking out for those in the next 6 months as well.
All right. Thanks, everyone. We are out of time. I mean, we started late, so I felt like we flew through this. But don't worry, audience. This isn't the last time we're going to do this. This is the first time we've tried it. We're going to continue these discussions around researchers and practitioners coming together around a specific topic. So thanks so much. I want to thank everybody in the chat room and those of you that were watching. We appreciate that. If you're interested in learning more about connected learning, make sure to check out the Connected Learning Alliance site at clalliance.org. where there are tremendous testimonials from practitioners, like the ones you've heard from today, and informative multimedia pieces that you're going to get from Molly as well. And if you'd like to keep abreast of future opportunities from Educator Innovator and partners like the ones we heard from today, the Exploratorium, Park Day School, the Creativity Lab at Lighthouse Charter School in Oakland, sign up for the monthly newsletter at educatorinnovator.org and follow Educator Innovator on Twitter at innovates_ed. Thanks so much for joining us, and have a happy Tuesday. Take care.
Thanks.